Having pink for our class color is pretty incriminating against Blizzard, I have to admit, but unfortunately it's not the only effeminating evidence that Blizzard doesn't like paladins. Take a look at this item from Zul'Gurub. This never actually made it into the live version, but it was in the beta version while Zul'Gurub was still in the works. And I really don't want to insult adolescent girls here, not that they'd probably be watching this anyway, but yeah, this is very insulting to paladins. I have to give this another skull here because, yikes. And I'm going to have to make this a 10 skull because none of the other classes had anything after looks like a hunter or looks like a druid. It was just paladins, and this was insulting. Thank you Deimos, Phobos, and Dorinku for pointing these things out to me and showing me the links to them. It is crystal clear that whoever put that together had something against paladins. But the question comes up, does that mean that all of Blizzard has something against paladins? I can't really say that they did, because over the years a lot of things have gotten better for paladins. Some people would argue that paladins have always had it good, and that paladins have always been powerful. And I have to admit, we may well be on the razor's edge of being overpowered. I have good reason for thinking this. Back when I was level 45, I single-handedly took down a 48 named elite. Here's how it happened. I went to get the quest to get the key to the Searing Gorge, an obsolete quest now that you can fly in there. I was level 45 at the time, and I didn't see anyone else around to help me take this character down. Crazy as I was, I decided, I'll test the water, see how powerful this thing is, and go fight it by myself. How crazy is that? But if you think that's crazy, think about the fact that I actually beat Margol by myself. Here's what I did. First of all, I had the fastest weapon available at the time, the Flurry Axe. After that, I used Seal of Wisdom and Judgment of Wisdom so that it would be hard for me to run out of mana. I saved my mana for heals, and then basically I just meleeed him to death with auto attack. The only fun in that, to be honest with you, was the fact that I was able to do it alone when it was supposed to be a group quest. It took forever to take him down, but on the other hand, I was able to do it. That proves that paladins are really, really powerful, and even were back then. But let's face it, that kind of power really doesn't scale well into player versus player. Fortunately, Blizzard recognized this and started making some changes to make paladins better in player versus player. One of the biggest things that got better was the addition of an on-demand ability. On-demand is good, remember that. This on-demand ability was Hammer of Wrath. It's essentially a ranged execute move. It deals a decent punch of damage, but only to characters who have 20% health or less. This meant that paladins had a stronger chance of actually making a kill in player versus player, and I have to admit it's an indication that Blizzard doesn't hate paladins. And before I go assigning a number to this one, I have to point out that Hammer of Wrath has a lot of things attached to it that other classes have to spend talent points to get. We don't have to spend talent points to get them for Hammer of Wrath. Hammer of Wrath has a really short cast time, and while most abilities that score critical hits usually do 1.5 times the normal damage when they crit, Hammer of Wrath does 2 times damage when it crits. Other classes have to spend 3-5 talent points to get that. We have to spend no talent points to get that. Hammer of Wrath deserves a big fat 10 heart. And that's not all. Back then, every class was having its talent trees and abilities looked at to make sure that they could do what they were supposed to be able to do and not be overpowered doing it. Paladin's turn was a little bit late in coming, but what happened when the Paladin's turn came around? Well, there was an awful lot of expectation for the Paladin's turn, because Paladins did have a lot of problems. They were crammed into a heal bot role, they didn't have a lot of damage, we couldn't tank anything besides the undead, we didn't have any ranged attacks, and most of the good stuff that our class had you had to spend talent points to get. When other classes' turns came up, like hunters and druids, useless abilities were removed, talents were replaced, and a lot of the time, stuff that you had to spend talent points to get got dropped down to trainable abilities. For example, Hurricane was massively changed for druids. It used to be a 31-point talent that you had to get in balance, but now it's a trainable ability that any druid can get at level 40. There were 2 abilities in particular that paladins were hoping would be dropped down to trainable abilities: Consecration and Holy Shock. Those were both on-demand holy damage abilities, but you had to spend talent points to get them. 31 points in Holy to get Holy Shock, and 21 points in retribution to get consecration. Since for one of our two threat generating tools at the time, you had to generate quite a bit of holy damage to get an enemy's attention, it would have been great for tanking if either or both of those abilities had been dropped down to trainable skills. Blizzard was asking us questions, trying to figure out, what do we need, what do we want, what's good for the class, what's bad for the class. There was a lot of expectation for this patch, but were we disappointed? Well, here's something to illustrate.
Hopefully this one will be more important. He's making a mockery of the internet.
Patch 1.9 was a major disappointment for Paladins. The only real problem it solved was some PvP viability. Well, there's one other thing that I failed to touch upon before, and that's buffing in raids. In a 40-man raid, given a 1.5 second global cooldown, you're going to spend a full minute buffing to get the entire raid. And since Paladin blessings only last 5 minutes, that means at least 20% of your time is going to be spent buffing in raids. When I said we wanted more buttons to click, this is not what I meant. Patch 1.9 came up with some semblance of a solution to that. They gave us something called greater blessings. Those are basically versions of our existing blessings that last longer but require a regent to cast. And when you cast it on one member of your raid, you cast it on multiple members, but Blizzard has a kind of a funny system for that. If, for example, you cast Greater Blessing of Salvation on one druid in your raid, all your druids in your raid get it. But that's not the best thing if you happen to have a bear tank. Other than that, it actually made things worse for tanking. And it further crammed Paladins into a heal bot, buff bot role. You remember those two on-demand holy damage abilities I was talking about before, Holy Shock and Consecration? Holy Shock was at the top of the holy tree, our healing tree. Retribution was our damage tree, and Protection was our tanking tree. Either one of those would have benefited more from Holy Shock than Holy does. The same goes for Consecration. Now, Consecration was originally in Retribution, our damage tree. If they had moved it to the Protection tree, it could have made Paladins halfway decent as off-tanks. But where did they move it instead of Protection? They moved it into Holy, of all places. They didn't drop it down to a trainable ability. They didn't move it to Protection. They moved it to Holy, the healing tree. Does it really make sense to put Consecration in the healing tree? And besides, if someone wants to be an off-tank, they have to spec all the way down in Protection to get our #1 threat generation and damage mitigating tool, Holy Shield, and then they have to spend more talent points in Holy to get Consecration. How many talent points are they left with at that point? Not a lot. And while I'm talking about Holy Shield, take a look at the way these talents migrated. Most of them actually went deeper in the trees. So that means Paladins have to spend more talent points to get the cool tools that let them specialize in a particular area, or rather, let them actually function at all in that area. That really defeats the purpose of playing a hybrid class. By definition, hybrids are supposed to be versatile and offer the people who play them a lot of options. Paladins really weren't offering a lot of options at that point. And in fact, they were offering fewer options than they were before the patch. The one build that started to look better and better was Holy. That's right, the healing build. That's why I say that they were trying to cram us even further into the heal bot role, because they were taking all the fun abilities and giving them to Holy. So where does that leave Paladins in terms of tanking? Well, before, there was this ability in Protection called Repentance. It was a 6-second stun, ranged, very good, but they moved that to Retribution to increase Retribution's PvP viability, and what they replaced it with was another buff. The best buff in the game, granted, but still a buff. This left Protection with very little to offer, and since they didn't move Consecration or Holy Shock down to trainable abilities, and they also didn't move them into the Protection tree, there really weren't any options for generating threat. So things in general got worse for tanking.